Hello and welcome to this CNBC-TV18 special Power Talk edition. I'm Ronojoy Banerjee, and my guest today is well-known author, principal economic advisor to the Government of India, Sanjeev Sanyal, who just a short while back propounded an interesting theory, the economics of chaos and complexity. What is it and what is its resonance with the Indian economy? Sanjeev, you are associated not so much with mainstream economic thinking. You're seen more as a, as a challenger to the mainstream economic thought. Where does this theory fit in?
So you see, most mainstream economics is based essentially on an idea that the economy is some sort of a gigantic machine. Now this is very much embedded in socialist planning kind of thinking, but it also actually underlies conceptually a lot of other forms of economics. Let's say whether you take neoclassical economics, Keynesian economics, monetarist economics, and so on. And this is the reason when you talk to economists, they love using words like equilibriums, liquidity, lever of monetary policy. And these are all, as you can notice, Newtonian mechanics terms.
Right.
Right? So the reason for this is not surprising, because you see, much of this is the thinking on which this is based is really the technology of 100 years ago.
Okay.
Which was basically about Victorian steam engines.
Right.
Right? And what were the Victorian steam engines? They were running on predetermined tracks.
Right.
And the real economic debate was how much coal to throw in when the steam engine slowed down,
right,
or how hard to pull the brake when it sped up too much.
Right.
So this whole gamut of thinking is consequently very much dependent on a very mechanical worldview. Now this is a real problem if in reality the economy is not a machine but something like an evolving ecosystem. So this is when you get into the economics of complexity and chaos. So suddenly you're in a world where it's an ecosystem which is continuously evolving. Think of it as a system, like a biological, organic system that's being buffeted by all kinds of mutations and shocks. It could be technology, it could be geopolitical risks, it could be domestic factors.
The exogenous shocks.
It could be exogenous, endogenous.
Which the economic models of today does not factor in.
Yeah, it could be exogenous, endogenous, together, complex. Okay. So this is a world in which there is no equilibrium. There are only continuous transitions. Okay, so this is a world of unintended consequences. This is a world of butterfly effects. So there is very little correlation. Say you can have a big shock and a very small impact. And you can have a very small impact and a very big shock. This is the butterfly effect. So this is a very different way of thinking about economics than the conventional worldview. Having said that, even though it is not mainstream, it has a very long lineage, interestingly. So the entire Austrian school of economics, for example, is very closely related to this. There is a whole literature, for example, done by Hayek on this, but it's also embedded in many parts of Indian philosophical thinking. So you have, for example, the idea of Shiva. Shiva is both the god of destruction and of rebirth. Why? Because of this process of churn that is a very embedded part of this kind of organic economics. Right. The idea of manthan, again, the idea of churn. And the churn throws up, just like with creative destruction, it throws up both poisons, vish and amrit, nectar. So this kind of thinking is not new. Unfortunately, in mainstream economics, it has not really filtered through very much to, especially Indian policy making, even though, of course, as I mentioned, people like Hayek have won Nobel Prizes for their thinking.
But in India, it's very considered to be very, very peripheral. We still want to go by the equilibrium models, forecasting models, which, by the way, even after the global financial crisis, those models were discredited. They had come under a lot of criticism.
Absolutely.
So somewhere do you feel that, and everybody says we are living in that VUCA world, they call it volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and I think A stands for ambiguous. So therefore, it's become even more relevant today that let's not have these fixated models because they're just not good enough to to sort of predict what is going to happen in the future.
So I have only one difference of opinion. The world has always been like this. There is no point in history where it was not like this.
Okay.
So when much of this steam engine economics was invented in the early part of the 20th century. So let's go back to the early part of the 20th century. Let's say I'm sitting in 1913 and I have 14 years of great data and I plug it into my computational general equilibrium model, and it gives me great results based on the previous 40 years of data. What happened in the previous 40 years of data? It was a period of great peace. I mean, there were a few wars here and there, but largely it was very peaceful. There was a lot of globalization that happened. And then what happened in 1913 onwards? You suddenly, with the next 40 years, you had 2 world wars and a Great Depression. There was no way you would have been able to use any of your modeling to have been able to predict what was going to happen going forward. So this entire approach is what I am questioning. Now, this is not to say that modeling is not useful. It is useful. But it is useful for something very specific, which is to work out what are the combinations of outcomes, to stress test systems, not to predict definitely which particular path you will go down. Because as I pointed out, this is a world of unintended consequences and unpredetermined paths. History goes down, and by the way, I've written my books of history, those of you who read it, actually talk about this, about complex adaptive systems. So there is a use for stress testing ideas, working out scenarios, but it is not very useful for knowing which of those particular scenarios you're actually going to end up in. And of course, there's always a chance that something you never thought about could happen, and which is the whole Nassim Taleb thesis, the Black Swan theory. These too could happen. So ultimately, yes, modeling is interesting. It allows you to think about issues, perhaps work out a few scenarios that could happen and prepare for the more obvious ones. But in the end, what wins in the long run is the flexibility and adaptation.
So Indian economy is not a steam engine.
Absolutely.
And that is the point you're essentially stressing on.
Yes. So it's not about building a better steam engine or building a diesel engine. It's not a steam engine.
How is it now becoming relevant in the India context? Because what does, let's just say, the Narendra Modi government represent? Are some of these thoughts becoming more mainstream now, which you've said so far has at best been peripheral?
So actually, one of the things that is interesting is that in 1991, we did abandon the old socialist approach to planning, but we did not quite abandon the meta-narrative, the underlying conceptual framework of the machine. And what is now happening is that meta-narrative itself is being questioned and adapted and changed. So this is, you will see through in multiple interesting ways. So what would this ecosystem type thinking, what kind of changes will lead to? One of the things is that because it is a disaggregated worldview, it runs, so what is it that anchors it? So the thing that anchors it, one is a rule-based society. Okay, so that requires many things. One is a culture of following the rules, okay, and you will see a fair amount of effort. That is why the emphasis on breaking down on corruption, or a shock therapy like demonetization. I mean, demonetization in a narrow sense was about black money in cash, but in a wider sense, it's about shock therapy to tell people that the business of the old style has now been gotten rid of. You're now into a more rule-based system. That is one. But it also requires other things. For example, it requires enforcement of contracts. So there is, as you may notice, a lot of debate about the judicial system, how to make it work better. Recently was a debate about whether to have a national exam system for getting in judges into the lower level. I mean, you can debate whether they're good ideas or not. But I'm trying to say that is why suddenly these issues are important. Similarly, why was it that of all the various reforms that are needed, bankruptcy law was the one that... Because in this mutating, chaotic world, the idea is that any form of entrepreneurship will lead to some risk. Some of it will go wrong. So you have to have a system that is continuously liquidating the bad mutations, so to speak, and allowing the good ones to flourish. That is the only way. It is a very different way of thinking than, say, the BIFR way of thinking, which is, oh, sorry, it was bad luck that somehow it went wrong, but we can nurse this back to... That's not the way this is thinking. Here NPAs happen. They're part of an entrepreneurial society.
So willing to take the harder decisions. That if
you have to make it, liquidate and carry on. This is not to demonize business failure. This should be no... this is just purely business as usual.
So governments attempts, at demonetization was really a signal that we need to change the economic meta-narrative.
Yes,
that's been,
it's a rule-based society where, and again, another thing that a lot of emphasis the Prime Minister gives: simplify the rules, right? Get rid of old rules. So you can see where it's all coming from, and you can see how things also get implemented is different. Okay, in an adaptive way, which to those who don't understand it looks chaotic. I'll show you, illustrate it for you.
Okay.
Let's take, for example, the GST.
Okay.
Okay. Now, in the old system of thinking of how do you create a machine? You sit and you design the machine as meticulously as possible, and then you build a machine and follow that design very well. But that is not how ecosystems can be run.
Okay.
What you do there in an ecosystem, because it's full of unintended consequences, and you cannot model it. You cannot model it clearly.
Okay.
The thing to do is to have a broad framework, which is a flexible framework, and basically you begin to implement it and have a feedback loop to sort the problem out.
Okay.
So if you go back to now the GST,
okay,
the old way of doing it would have been spend 5 years planning what to do, then another 5 years trying to implement that as meticulously as possible, and it's very likely at the end of the 10 years you would have a system that's dysfunctional.
Okay. Right.
Instead, what do? You decide that yes, doesn't matter what we do, we will never know exactly what will happen until we do it.
We are at peace with the fact that it is an imperfect system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You are at first, you start up with the fact that it is an imperfect system. You just work out basically the contours of what it is, and then you create a feedback loops, which is why the response teams that have been created to get feedback. We are fully aware that it will not work the first round. Finance Minister keeps saying that yes, at some future date we will simplify it.
Right.
Okay, but the old way would have been to simplify, then do some lot of thought, negotiation, this, that. Here we will do it and then simplify it. Because we do not know what will happen when we actually implement these things. So as we implement, there will be feedback, adjust. Feedback, adjust. So this is a feedback loop based model of governance. And it looks messy initially, but it is much faster. We don't waste time on things. And we assume that it will not be perfect. So we fix it along the way, and there is no end to this fixing. 30 years from now, somebody will be sitting with the GST still fixing it. But key to it, that is ex ante, you have to pay some attention to a few things. One is that cannot make it too complicated a system.
Okay, right.
More complicated it is, more difficult it is to fix it. And there are more unintended consequences. Therefore, the preference is always, if in doubt, simplify. Now, for a number of reasons, the GST that was implemented is more complicated than, say, the technocrats and the finance minister, whatever, are preferred.
Okay.
But it has been implemented. Now, over time, we'll see what happens out of it, and it will be adjusted.
So how does the role of economists change then, Mr. Sanyal, in this context, in the context of the theory that you're telling me?
First of all, economists stop calling themselves eminent economists. Basically, what we are is, hopefully, intelligent people, but at least open-minded people who are watching what is happening in real life and not allowing a predetermined model to cloud the view that we are having of what is happening in real time. So the most important thing to us is real time, not what some preconceived model is telling us. Okay? You need to do some modeling, as I pointed out, to work out what are the likely outcomes. But once the game begins, you just watch what happens and react to it. So this whole idea of wise men sitting in planning commission.
So nobody claims to know.
Nobody claims to know.
It's more, open, it's more, and everybody participates.
Everybody participates
in this whole feedback
loop, and hopefully some people may be somewhat better at doing feedback and adjustment, some people worse. But there is this whole idea of this great wise man who tells you how to run everything is gone. So that's why you don't have, the planning commission has consequently been replaced by the Niti Aayog. This is not just a name change, as many people may think. It is a fundamental cultural change.